They couldn't believe Africans built it. So instead of celebrating it, they burned it. They looted it. And then they erased it from history. This is the story of the Kingdom of Benin, an African empire Europe feared, destroyed, and never wanted you to remember. For generations, we were told a single story about Africa, that before colonization, Africa had no real cities and advanced systems, and art worth preserving, and civilization worth studying. But that story falls apart the moment you look at Benin. Because long before European cities mastered planning, sanitation, and structured governance, Benin was already living in the future. And when Europeans finally saw it with their own eyes, they were stunned. In the late 1400s, Portuguese explorers arrived in what is now southern Nigeria. What they expected: mud huts, disorder, chaos. What they found: a city that rivaled Europe's greatest capitals. Benin City had wide, straight roads stretching for miles, organized residential districts, massive defensive walls and earthworks, a powerful centralized government. European accounts describe streets as straight as an arrow, so clean in order that visitors were confused. One European traveler wrote that Benin was larger and better planned than many cities in Europe at the time. Let that sink in. Here's something history textbooks barely mention. The walls of Benin were one of the largest man-made earthworks on the planet, longer than the Great Wall of China in total length, the walls of ancient Babylon, built without modern machinery, constructed through collective labor, engineering knowledge, and precise planning. These walls protected the kingdom for centuries, and yet most people have never heard of them. Why? Because acknowledging them would shatter the myth that Africa had no advanced civilizations. Benin wasn't ruled by disorder. It was governed by structure. At the center of power was the Oba of Benin, a king whose authority was balanced by councils, chiefs, and guilds. Every profession had a guild: bronze casters, ivory carvers, warriors, traders. These guilds passed knowledge down through generations, ensuring consistency, mastery, and cultural continuity. This wasn't a primitive society. This was a system-built civilization. Then there was the art, the Benin bronzes, intricate brass and bronze sculptures depicting kings, warriors, ceremonies, and everyday life, created using the lost wax casting technique, a method so complex that when Europeans saw it, they refused to believe Africans made it. Some claimed it must have been taught by Europeans. Others suggested they were inspired by outsiders. Anything except the truth, that Africans were masters of metallurgy, storytelling, and historical record-keeping through art. Benin wasn't just culturally rich, it was politically and economically powerful. The kingdom controlled trade routes. It regulated commerce. It dictated terms to foreign traders, including Europeans. Benin did not beg. Benin negotiated. And Europe does not like partners it cannot dominate, especially African ones. At first, Europe admired Benin, but admiration quickly turned into frustration because Benin refused exploitative trade terms, foreign control, religious domination. The Oba protected his sovereignty fiercely, and that made Benin dangerous, not because it attacked Europe, but because it proved Africa did not need Europe. By the 1800s, Europe's hunger for control had grown violent. The British wanted Benin's wealth, influence, and symbolic power. They framed the kingdom as hostile. They labeled it uncivilized. They prepared the world for what came next. A narrative had to be created, so destruction could be justified. In 1897, Britain made its move, not with diplomacy, not with respect, but with fire. An expedition was launched, not to negotiate, but to punish, loot, and erase. What happened next wasn't a battle. It was a calculated destruction of one of Africa's greatest civilizations. And the treasures stolen from Benin would end up in museums around the world, labeled as artifacts, not evidence. Watch to the end as we expose the brutal invasion of Benin, the theft of thousands of priceless artworks, and why Europe still refuses to return what was stolen. Because the truth about Benin is not just history, it's unfinished business. In 1897, the British Empire did not come to Benin to negotiate. They came with guns. They came with fire. They came with orders. Officially, it was called a punitive expedition. But in reality, it was an invasion. British troops marched into Benin City with modern weapons against a city that had stood for centuries. Homes were torched. Sacred sites were destroyed. People were killed or forced to flee. By the end of it, Benin City was in ruins. Not because it was weak, but because it was targeted. After the city fell, the soldiers didn't just leave. They looted. Thousands of priceless artworks were stolen. Bronze plaques, ivory carvings, sacred royal objects, historical records cast in metal. These were not decorations. They were archives, Africa's way of recording history. Crates of Benin art were shipped to Europe like trophies. And today, many of them sit in British museums, German collections, private European vaults, labeled as Benin bronzes, not stolen history, not war loot, just artifacts. Once the art was taken, something else happened. Benin's story was rewritten. Textbooks began describing the kingdom as violent, backward, primitive. The sophistication Europeans witnessed was conveniently forgotten, because you cannot justify theft if the victim is seen as advanced. You cannot justify destruction if the target is respected. So the truth had to disappear. Here's the part history avoids. European museums gained prestige because of Benin. Scholars marveled at the craftsmanship. Artists studied the techniques. Modern art movements were influenced by African aesthetics. Africa was declared uncivilized, while its stolen creations educated the world. That contradiction still exists today. For over a century, descendants of Benin have asked a simple question. If these works were stolen, why are they still there? Some countries have started returning pieces. Others still delay. Some refuse entirely. The argument? That the artifacts are safer in Europe, as if Africa has no right to protect its own memory. This story is not just about the past. It's about who gets to tell history, who decides what is valuable, who controls cultural memory. Benin represents every African story that was interrupted, but not erased, because even without its walls, even without its bronzes, even without its throne, the legacy survived. Europe tried to destroy Benin to make a statement, but the opposite happened. Benin became proof that Africa had systems, Africa had art, Africa had power, Africa had sovereignty, and that truth refuses to stay buried. Benin was not alone. Across the continent, African societies adapted, resisted, and evolved, some through diplomacy, others through innovation, and some through warfare so revolutionary that it reshaped history. One of those figures was Shaka Zulu, a leader who learned from centuries of African systems and turned resistance into legend. History did not forget Benin by accident. It was erased on purpose. But erased stories have a way of returning, especially when they were built on truth. If you're watching this, you're part of that return. And this is only the beginning. If this story moved you, if it challenged what you were taught, if it made you see Africa differently, subscribe. Next, we tell the story of the warrior who refused to be conquered.